Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, your friendly guide to the English language. We talk about writing, history, rules, and other cool stuff. Today's topics are when to use the word the before nouns, and why it's so much easier to remember things that rhyme. And just a quick note before we start, we are getting close to the new school year, and I really want all you educators out there to know about my free LinkedIn Learning writing courses, because I think they'll make your life easier and help your students. Check out your county or university library to see if you can get them free. Most of the time you can. Once you're there, search for Grammar Girl, choose the course that pops up, and then click on my name to see all 7 courses. Several listeners have written with questions on when to use the definite article the indefinite article a, or neither. For example, Tracy W. wrote, quote, "Which is correct? Thank you for taking time to review my application," or "Thank you for taking the time to review my application," unquote. Well, the use of articles is a tricky subject, with many exceptions and idiosyncrasies. We can't cover all the cases today, but we can look at the basic rules and see how they apply to Tracy's question. We'll start with some facts about nouns. First, some nouns in English can't stand alone. For example, you can't just say cat crossed the road. You have to say something like a cat, the cat, Squiggly's cat, every cat, or maybe no cat. The possessive noun Squiggly's, every, and no are all examples of what linguists call determiners, and in English, some nouns have to have determiners. So exactly which nouns need them? Well, countable, singular nouns, such as cat, must have a determiner. Of course, if you're writing about a cat named Cat, or someone named Catherine who's called Cat for short, then cat crossed the road works. And this brings us to one kind of noun that doesn't have to have a determiner, the proper noun. Proper nouns usually don't have determiners. For example, you wouldn't say a squiggly or every squiggly, except in the unusual situation where there's more than one person named Squiggly. Plurals can go without determiners too. Although you can say the cats, you can also just say cats if you don't have any particular cats in mind. Mass nouns, also called uncountable nouns, don't need a determiner either. Take the uncountable noun information. Although you can say, I need your information, or I need the information, you can also just say, I need information, if you don't want to be specific. Mass nouns usually allow any determiner, provided it's not one that implies the noun is countable. So you can't say something like one information, two information, or many information. In particular, you can't say an information, because a, which is a form of the word one, implies that information is a countable noun. Some nouns don't fit nicely into these categories. Next, let's consider the nouns that can go either way. So what about that noun, time? On the one hand, you can say, knock 3 times, and have a great time. So time can be a countable noun when it's referring to particular events. On the other hand, time also has a general sense, as in, time is on my side, and Marty McFly traveled through time. Used this way, time is a mass noun. It sounds strange to say a time is on my side and Marty McFly traveled through one time. In thank you for taking time to review my application, we're using time as a mass noun, so we can omit the. Nevertheless, we can still use a determiner as long as the determiner doesn't imply countability. That means it's okay to say the time. To choose between time and the time, we need to say more about the definite article. The is called the definite article because you use it when you're talking about something that's distinguished from other things. In other words, something defined or definite. If you say, the cat crossed the road, this cat might be distinguished from other things because it's the only cat in the neighborhood, or just because it's the only cat mentioned earlier in the conversation. So if you write, thank you for taking the time to review my application, that indicates you're talking about a definite amount of time, whatever amount of time it takes to review your application. If, however, you just say, thank you for taking time to review my application, you're thanking the readers for any amount of time they might take to review your application, even if it's just a millisecond. For that reason, thank you for taking the time seems like the better option. This argument isn't airtight, though. You could argue that it'll be obvious to your audience that you're thanking them for taking a sufficient amount of time to review your application, that only perverse, hostile readers would understand it as thanking them for taking any old amount of time, and therefore it's safe to leave out the. All I can say at this point is that both options are used in the real world, and both are grammatically and stylistically defensible. Now, before we finish, let's get to the rule for using the indefinite article a. It's called the indefinite article because you use it when you're talking about something that you're not trying to distinguish from other things. If you say, a cat crossed the road, it could be any cat. If you say, I wish a cat would cross the road, there might not even be a cat. In short, with countable singular nouns, you have to use a determiner. Use whatever determiner you need. In particular, use the if you're distinguishing the noun from other things, and use a if you're not. With proper nouns, plural nouns, and mass nouns, determiners aren't necessary, though you can still use them, depending on the meaning you're after. But remember not to use a or any other determiner that implies counting with a mass noun. That segment was written by Neil Whitman, an independent writer and consultant specializing in language and grammar and a member of the Reynoldsburg, Ohio School Board. You can search for him by name on Facebook or find him on his blog at literalminded.wordpress.com. Have you ever wondered why it's so much easier to remember things that rhyme? Like, why do you still know the I before E except after C rule you probably learned in grade school? Or why, when I say an apple a day, many of you know the next words are keeps the doctor away? Well, it is all happening in our brains, and it turns out that our brains love rhymes. They're kind of like a mindless solitaire game for memory because they're just so easy for our brains to process. And that's for a few different reasons. Different parts of our brain are activated for different activities. And when you're reading a rhyme, it not only activates the part of your brain normally involved in reading, it also activates the part of your brain involved in processing speech. You're essentially imagining what the words sound like, which is technically called acoustic encoding, and that makes remembering the rhyme easier. And as an aside, it turns out we do the same thing when we're reading dialogue. For example, a study found that a sentence like, Squiggly said, I feel like I'll never put the confetti incident behind me, created a more vivid reading experience than a sentence like, Squiggly said he feels like he'll never put the confetti incident behind him. Also, the way information is stored in the brain and the way it's pulled back out make it easier for us to remember words that are related in some way, whether that's words that sound similar like rhymes, or words that have related meanings or are connected in some other way. For example, a book called Memory in Oral Traditions by David C. Rubin describes students who were asked to name body parts off the top of their head, and they reliably named things together that you'd think of as related. For example, they'd say hand and then finger, eyes, ears, and then mouth and nose. And if you give students a list of words to remember that are just random, they'll try to impose some kind of structure on the list to help themselves remember. So words exist in our brains in ways that connect them to other related words. And it's easier for us to remember words that are closely related than words that don't have much to do with each other. It limits the universe of words you have to consider when thinking about what comes next. For example, if I say, the mouse picked up his blank, your brain is getting ready for any noun. But if you know the first part is the beginning of a rhyme, your brain is already homing in on the much smaller set of possible nouns, like house and spouse. The connected sounds of rhymes help us tap into these smaller word networks, which makes remembering things easier. Here's an example. September and November are connected in our brains both because they're months and because they rhyme. So when I say 30 days hath September, April, June, and November, and then you're trying to remember it again tomorrow, if you can remember the first line, you're going to have a pretty easy time remembering that the last line ends with November because of the way those two words are connected and rhyme. In fact, I've heard people say that the whole rhyme doesn't work very well for them because they can never remember the middle part with April and June, which, don't rhyme. They have trouble with the non-rhyming part, but not the rhyming part. Researchers also think that because we're awash in rhymes from the time we're small, starting with nursery rhymes and children's songs, we build up a vast network of words that we know rhyme. So when someone tells you for the first time, leaves of 3, let them be, to help you identify poison ivy, you already know that 3 and B rhyme because you've probably heard them rhyme before, and we're also more likely to remember things that are familiar. Another thing that blew my mind as I was reading about rhymes is that studies have shown that we actually are more likely to believe something is true if it rhymes. In fact, it's such a well-known cognitive bias that it has a name, the rhyme as reason effect. Researchers have found, for example, that if you hear woes unite foes instead of woes unite enemies, you are more likely to believe that troubles really do bring foes together. There's a whole class of pithy words of wisdom called rhyming aphorisms, and you probably know at least some of them, and maybe believe them, if you grew up in the United States, because the rhymes make them both memorable and convincing. Besides an apple a day, we have your health is your wealth, fake it till you make it, when the cat's away the mice will play, birds of a feather flock together, and so on. Some people even believe the rhyme as reason effect may have played a role in O.J. Simpson getting a not guilty verdict in his 1995 trial because of the memorable and apparently extra convincing rhyme his lawyer Johnny Cochran used, calling to mind a bloody glove from the murder scene. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Advertisers definitely take advantage of this effect to make us more likely to believe their sales pitches and buy their products. Think of plop, plop, fizz, fizz, oh, what a relief it is, and Nationwide is on your side. The good news is that researchers have also found that once you're aware of the rhyme as reason effect, you aren't as susceptible to it. So just by listening to this podcast, you have already become more resilient. And they also suggest restating a phrase without the rhyme if you will want to evaluate it on its merits instead of being influenced by the rhyme. Is it really true that if I eat an apple every day, I'll be less likely to need to go to the doctor? Probably not, at least not if that's the only fruit or vegetable you eat. Maybe an apple isn't meant to be taken literally and it's a stand-in for a good diet. But once you start really thinking about it, the original message doesn't hold up. But why do we think rhymes are more truthful in the first place? Well, one reason is that we find them aesthetically pleasing, beautiful, and researchers have found that when we like something, it's also easier for our brains to process. And again, our brains seem to like things that are easy. It's like they say, yes, that was easy to understand, so it must be true. So if you want people to remember something and believe it's true, state it as a rhyme. It worked for I before E except after C when sounding like A as in neighbor and way. But keep it short. Research from the 1980s also shows that the ability to remember a spoken rhyme verbatim starts to decline after about 50 words. Finally, I have a Familect story.
Hey, Grammar Girl. This is Jessica from Hampton, Virginia. I'm sort of a recent listener, and that I just came back to listening to your podcast a few days ago. but I used to listen years ago when I was 14. I'm 27 now. My dad found your podcast for me because I loved to write back then. And it's really been interesting how listening to you has really brought back memories of how much I used to love to write. But I'm calling in because I want to share a family. I actually have two. My parents have all of my life referred to the TV remote as the binker. And that came from when my mother was little. The first people she ever knew to have a remote was the kind of remote that, when you click the buttons light up. And so they used to call it the blinker. But she was a little girl and she didn't understand what they were saying. She thought they called it the binker, and that's what she thought it was called for a really long time. So even as an adult now, she'll still sometimes say binker instead of remote. So when I was growing up, I picked up on that too. We're at the point now where maybe my husband says it. And then another family that came up in recent years, a few years ago when I was at my parents' house, I asked my mom if she had already opened a line. And I didn't really think about what I was saying. So she looked at me and said, "Open lime." And I was like, do you already have a lime in the fridge that you've cut? So I just want a wedge of lime for my drink, and I'm not going to cut open another lime if you already have one that you've cut into. And we laughed about that, but then it actually became a thing that we say over and over again. Like, it's been years, and my husband says it, both of my parents say it. We'll use it as a verb, and we'll use it as an adjective. So we'll say, "Hey, is there an open onion in the fridge?" Or we'll say, "Hey, do you want me to open this pineapple? I think it's ripe and ready to eat." So that was just two family that I wanted to share with you. I really enjoyed your show, and I'm so glad I come back to listening. It was such a wonderful surprise when I looked you up. I found that you're still doing Grammar Girl after all these years. So thank you so much for that. I really enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Yep, I'm still here, and I love hearing about people coming back to the show. Binker is fun, and the concept of opening a lime is downright useful. If you have a Familect story to share, I'd love to hear it. And now you can send me a voice memo on WhatsApp, which generally makes the audio sound better than the old voicemail line. And it's also easier for people who are outside the United States. So non-US people, now is your time. The link is in the show notes, and it occurred to me that some of you might not know how to find the show notes. They're in different places in different apps, but in Apple Podcasts, after you click on the episode, just scroll down. And in Spotify, after you click on the episode, then click See More. That's where we put all the important links for each episode, so check it out and send me your Familect story. Finally, if you're an educator, check out my free LinkedIn Learning courses at your county or university library. Grammar Girl is a quick and dirty tips podcast. Thanks to Holly Hutchings in digital operations, Davina Tomlin in marketing, Morgan Christensen in advertising, Dan Feierabend in audio, and Brandon Getchus, director of podcasts, who just started relearning the saxophone, much to the frustration of his downstairs neighbors. And I'm Mignon Fogarty. That's all. Thanks for listening.